All right, strap yourselves in, everyone, because today we are diving deep into the network of right-wing groups here in Australia.
We're going to be looking at who they are, how they operate, and how they're all connected.
And just to make things even more interesting, this deep dive is super relevant as we head towards the 2025 election.
Absolutely. And like always, we've got a variety of sources to pull from.
Articles, Wikipedia rabbit holes, and even some publications straight from the think tanks themselves.
The mission here is to give you the knowledge you need to really understand this landscape.
Exactly. It's like we're giving you a decoder ring for Australian politics.
Yeah, it's like...
So where do we even start with all of this?
Well, a good starting point, I think, is Advance.
Advance, formerly known as Advance Australia.
That's right.
They always like to present themselves as like this grassroots movement.
Yeah, a real Aussie battler kind of vibe.
But I don't know. Something about that never quite sat right with me.
Well, your instincts are spot on there. Advance kind of burst onto the scene back in 2018, and they claimed it was to counter, those progressive groups like GetUp. But if we look at their funding, a different picture emerges.
Oh, okay. Tell me more, because that's always where things get interesting.
Right. So in 2022, 2023 alone, they brought in $5.2 million.
Wow.
Now get this. $2.4 million of that came from undisclosed donors.
Hold up. $2.4 million from we don't even know who.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a lot of money to be just floating around. It makes you wonder who's really pulling the strings.
It raises serious questions about transparency for sure and, potentially conflicts of interest.
Yeah, because they love to talk about representing the average Aussie.
Right.
But those funding numbers, well, they tell a different story.
They do. And it's not just about the big money coming from those mystery donors either.
Oh, are there more?
Their average donation size is actually surprisingly small.
Really?
It sits at around $160.
So they're pulling in millions, but the average person is only chipping in like $100 or so.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a head scratcher, isn't it?
It really is, because it just doesn't add up with this image they're trying to project, this whole grassroots thing.
It's fueled accusations of astroturfing.
Astroturfing.
Basically creating this illusion of widespread support while actually being bankrolled by just a handful of people.
Oh, okay, so it's all a bit of a facade.
You could say that.
Like a carefully constructed political stage set?
Yeah, and if we look at some of the key players involved, it gets even more interesting.
Interesting in a good way, or a I need to hide under my desk kind of way.
Let's just say it raises even more questions about transparency.
Okay, you've got me hooked. Who are these mysterious figures behind Advance?
Well, the three directors are Matthew Sheahan, Laura Jean Bradley, and Vicki Dunn.
Vicki Dunn, she was a Liberal MP, wasn't she?
That's right.
Okay, so we've got a former politician in the mix.
Yep, and that's not necessarily a red flag, but it definitely adds another layer.
What about the other two?
This is where things get a bit wild. When Bradley and Sheahan registered with ASICs, they provided residential addresses that turned out to be fake.
Why fake addresses?
Fake address.
What was he trying to hide?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It certainly doesn't scream transparency.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And speaking of Matthew Sheahan, he seems like an interesting character, too.
Oh, he is. There's barely any information about him online before he got involved with Advance.
And the address he gave turned out to be a law firm.
A law firm in Adelaide.
Seriously. What's going on here?
It's definitely something voters should be aware of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's not get too caught up in the individuals just yet.
Right.
I want to talk about Advance's tactics,
Okay.
especially during that voice referendum. I mean, their campaign was pretty aggressive.
Yeah, it was a prime example of how they operate.
You mean all those social media pages that seemed independent?
Like Fair Australia Referendum News and Not Enough.
Yeah, those ones. They were everywhere during the referendum.
Right, and it turned out they were actually all created by Advance.
Oh, wow. So they were trying to make it look like there was this whole grassroots movement against the voice.
Exactly. It was all very carefully orchestrated.
Sneaky.
And let's not forget about that controversial cartoon that was published in the Australian Financial Review during the whole debate.
The one with Thomas Mayo.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really offensive and kind of a dog whistle, don't you think?
Yeah, it sparked a lot of criticism.
It did, and I think it was a really clear reminder of the kinds of tactics Advance is willing to use.
Right.
It shows us that we need to be really careful about the information we're consuming.
Especially during an election year.
Exactly, because it's easy to get swept up in all the noise.
It is. You really need to look beyond the surface. Ask yourself, who's behind the message? What are they trying to achieve? And what tactics are they using?
All great points. Okay, so before we move on to the next big player in this network, can we just do a quick recap of Advance's policies and goals?
Sure. On the surface, they're all about what they call traditional values.
Like what? family, freedom, Aussie barbecues.
You're not far off. They really emphasize family free markets and even a Judeo-Christian heritage for Australia. And then on the flip side, they're very much opposed to left-wing activists and what they see as excessive political correctness.
It's like they're appealing to this sense of nostalgia.
Right, like a yearning for a simpler time when things were less complicated.
And judging by their fundraising, it seems to be working.
It does resonate with a certain segment of the population, for sure.
But, one traditional value they seem to be leaving out is concern for the environment.
Right.
I mean, they're pretty vocal about their climate change skepticism.
Oh, absolutely. They've gone so far as to call it a hoax and even advocate for teaching climate skepticism in schools.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
It is, and it's definitely something to keep in mind as we analyze their influence.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on Advance. Now they're funding their tactics, their key players, and their policy stances.
Yep.
But there's another major player in this right-wing network, right?
There is one that's a bit newer to the scene, but already making a big splash.
Okay, I'm ready for the next chapter in this political thriller.
All right, let's talk about the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, or ARC for short.
ARC.
Mm.
Okay, what makes them so interesting?
Well, they like to present themselves as this international movement, but their Aussie connections run deep.
Oh, intriguing. Tell me more about how ARC fits into this whole web of influence.
So remember how we were talking about Advance and all their tactics? So ARC gives us even more insight into how these groups operate and how connected they are.
Oh, that's a perfect segue. I'm all ears. So tell me, how does ARC fit into this whole network?
Well, they might present themselves as this international movement for, responsible citizenship, but they've got some serious Aussie roots. Their first conference was in London in 2023, but the second one, right here in Sydney this year.
Okay, so what you're saying is they're not just some international think tank.
Nope, not at all. And the Australian presence at both events, let's just say it was a who's who of Aussie politics.
Okay, you can't just drop a bombshell like that and not give me names. Who are we talking about here?
We're talking big names,
Yeah.
former prime ministers like Tony Abbott and John Howard, current politicians like Barnaby Joyce, Andrew Hastie, the list goes on and on.
Okay, so we're not talking about like a fringe group of academics here.
Not at all. And Amanda Stoker, she's a former Liberal senator. She actually sits on ARC's advisory board.
Wow, so these are people who have held, and in some cases still hold, real power in Australia.
Exactly, which is why it's so important to understand what they're all about. What are they trying to achieve? And how might that impact Australian politics, especially as we head towards the 2025 election?
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's dive into their agenda then. What are ARC's big ideas?
Well, their whole premise revolves around this idea that Western civilization is in decline.
Okay.
They're all about offering a better narrative, quote unquote, to save it.
That sounds pretty dramatic.
Yeah.
What exactly do they see as the problem?
Well, they see threats coming from both inside and outside Western civilization.
Okay.
Internally, they point to things like multiculturalism, identity politics, and what they call cultural Marxism.
Right, so a lot of buzzwords that get thrown around in these circles.
Exactly. And then externally, they're concerned about the rise of China Islamic extremism and this general erosion of Western values on the global stage.
It sounds like they're painting a pretty bleak picture of the world.
They are. They're basically saying that Western civilization is on the brink of collapse unless we embrace their vision of responsible citizenship.
And what does responsible citizenship look like according to ARC?
Well, they argue that Western civ can be renewed, but only if people return to traditional values.
Okay.
Things like personal responsibility, strong families, and limited government.
It's interesting how they keep coming back to these traditional values. It seems to be a common thread among all these right-wing groups.
It is. It's a way of appealing to people who feel like those values are under attack, like the world is changing too fast and they're being left behind.
Right. It's a powerful message, especially in times of uncertainty and change.
Yeah.
But how do they propose to implement these ideas? What's their strategy?
Well, they're not a political party, so they're not directly trying to win elections. Instead, they're more focused on influencing the political discourse, shaping the narrative, and ultimately swaying policy.
So they're playing a longer game, trying to shift the overall political landscape.
Exactly. And conferences like the one they had in Sydney are a key part of that strategy.
Because it's a chance to network strategize and build momentum.
Right. And those conferences can be pretty influential, especially when you've got big names like John Howard and Tony Abbott lending their credibility to the cause.
And speaking of the Sydney conference, some of the speeches there generated quite a bit of controversy.
Oh, yeah. John Howard, for example, expressed some skepticism about multiculturalism.
Multiculturalism.
Yeah.
Australia's long-standing policy of embracing diversity. What did he have to say about it?
He said he's always had trouble with the concept.
Hmm.
He argued that immigrants should be expected to adopt the values and practices of their new country.
That's quite a statement, especially in a country as diverse as Australia. It sounds like he's advocating for assimilation rather than integration.
You could interpret it that way, and it definitely sparked debate about the role of multiculturalism in modern Australian society.
And then there was Tony Abbott's speech where he declared that Australia was passing the point of peak woke.
Oh, yeah, that one.
What was he getting at there?
Well, he basically used his speech to denounce what he sees as an excessive focus on identity politics and social justice issues.
Okay.
He basically said that Australians are waking up to the travesty of woke culture and they're ready for a change.
Right, so it's that same old refrain, this silent majority rising up against the woke elite.
You got it. And he framed it as a positive development, like a sign that Australians are ready to embrace his brand of conservatism.
Interesting, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price was also there, the shadow minister for Indigenous Australians.
Right.
What did she have to say?
Well, she used her platform to criticize the Voice to Parliament referendum.
Which, of course, was ultimately rejected.
That's right. And she was a leading voice in that no campaign.
So what was her main argument against the Voice?
She argued that it would have divided Australians by race,
Okay.
and that it was a step backward from the 1967 referendum.
The one that granted Indigenous Australians equal citizenship rights.
Exactly. So she was framing the Voice as divisive rather than unifying.
But wasn't the No campaign itself pretty divisive? I mean, they used some pretty questionable tactics, including that racist cartoon we talked about earlier.
Yeah, that's a valid point, and it does raise questions about her commitment to unity and equality.
Definitely food for thought.
Mm.
Now, it wasn't just Australian speakers at this conference, right? There were some international guests as well.
That's right. They had speakers like Niall Ferguson, a British historian,
Okay.
and Erica Commissar, an American psychoanalyst,
Yeah.
both known for their conservative viewpoints.
And what kind of message were they bringing to Australia? Was it aligned with what we've been hearing from the Aussie speakers?
Very much so. They were echoing a lot of the same themes, the decline of Western civilization, the dangers of woke culture, the need to return to traditional values. It was all very much in line with this global right-wing narrative that we've been seeing gain traction in recent years.
It's almost like they're creating an international echo chamber,
Right.
amplifying these ideas and making them seem more widespread and influential than they might actually be.
You've hit on a key point there. By connecting with like-minded individuals and groups across borders, they're creating this sense of momentum and legitimacy for their movement.
Right, it's like a global network of conservative thought leaders sharing ideas and strategies.
Yeah.
And it's not just about ideas either. We talked about Advance's funding, but ARC also has some deep pockets backing them.
They do. ARC is funded by a combination of private donors and foundations,
Okay.
including Legatum, which is a Dubai-based investment group, and Paul Marshall, a British hedge fund billionaire.
Wow, so they're not exactly operating on a shoestring budget. It seems like these right-wing groups have a lot of resources at their disposal.
They do, and that gives them a significant advantage when it comes to promoting their agenda and influencing the political landscape.
So we've got Advance with their aggressive campaigning and ARC with their grand vision of cultural renewal. But how are these two groups actually connected?
Yeah.
Is it just a shared ideology, or is there something more concrete linking them together?
There are some very concrete connections. Remember how Tony Abbott is an advisor to Advance?
Yeah.
Well, he also sits on ARC's advisory board.
Oh, okay.
And it's not just him. There's a whole web of shared personnel overlapping agendas and potentially even shared funding sources connecting these two groups.
So it's not just two separate entities. It's a much larger and more interconnected network.
Exactly. And that network extends beyond Advance and ARC to include other right-wing entities like the Menzies Research Center.
The Menzies Research Center, the conservative think tank.
They've been actively promoting ARC's activities and even sending representatives to their conferences.
And the Australian Christian Lobby.
Oh, yeah.
They're known for their stance on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion.
Yes, and they definitely share common ground with Advance and ARC on issues like family values and religious freedom.
So this is a serious force to be reckoned with. But with all these different groups and agendas, what are their shared goals? What are they ultimately trying to achieve?
Broadly speaking, they're aiming to influence policy on a range of issues, from social welfare and climate change to immigration and education.
And they're not afraid to use their influence to impact elections, as we saw with Advance's activities during the voice referendum.
Right. And with the 2025 election on the horizon, we can expect to see this network become even more active in the coming months.
Right.
They'll be using all the tools at their disposal: social media campaigns, lobbying efforts, campaign donations, you name it.
So what can we as voters do to counter their influence? How can we make sure our voices are heard amidst all this noise?
Well, first and foremost, we need to be informed. We need to understand their tactics, their agendas, and the potential consequences of their actions. And don't just accept everything you hear at face value.
Right.
Fact-check information, consider different perspectives, and form your own opinions.
And don't be afraid to speak up.
Exactly. Challenge misinformation, hold politicians accountable, and vote for candidates who represent your values.
Because in a democracy, it's our voices that ultimately matter. We have the power to shape the future we want, but we need to exercise that power wisely and with careful consideration.
Well said.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this. It's a lot to take in.
I understand. It can be daunting to realize just how influential this network really is. But remember, we don't have to be passive observers. We can be active participants in the political process.
And knowledge is our best defense against manipulation.
Precisely. When we're informed, we're empowered.
So as we wrap up part 2 of this deep dive, is there anything else our listeners should keep in mind about this network as we head into the 2025 election?
Well, there's one more crucial element we haven't touched on yet: the religious dimension of this network. It's often overlooked, but it's a key driver of their worldview and their political agenda. And that's where we'll pick up in part 3.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Australia's right-wing network. And you mentioned that there's this whole religious dimension to all of this.
Yeah, it's something that often gets overlooked in mainstream political analysis, but it's actually crucial to understanding these groups.
Okay, I'm intrigued. We've been talking about Advance ARC, this whole network. Where does religion fit into all of this?
Well, remember how these groups are always talking about traditional values? Well, those values, they're not just some abstract concepts. They're deeply rooted in a very specific interpretation of Christianity.
So it's not just about politics. It's about faith informing their political agenda.
Exactly. For a lot of people within this network, their political activism is an extension of their religious beliefs.
Yeah.
They're fighting for a society that aligns with their understanding of Christian principles.
Okay, and what are those principles? What does this particular brand of Christianity emphasize?
They put a big emphasis on things like the sanctity of life, the traditional family structure, one man, one woman, and the importance of religious freedom.
Right.
They often frame these issues in terms of a culture war, between secular liberalism and traditional Christianity.
So it's that us versus them mentality again, but with this whole religious dimension added to the mix.
Exactly. They see themselves as this righteous minority fighting against a tide of secularism and moral decay.
And this whole idea of a religious mission really came through at the ARC conference, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Several speakers, including Jordan Peterson, spoke about the need to reclaim Western civilization from the clutches of secularism and rebuild society on a foundation of Christian values.
And they kept coming back to this idea of a Judeo-Christian heritage.
Yes, that's a key part of their narrative. They see Western civilization as being fundamentally rooted in Judeo-Christian values, and they believe those values are under threat.
From things like secular humanism and multiculturalism.
Exactly.
So it's not just about winning elections or passing specific policies. It's about preserving a certain way of life.
Right, and a way of life that they see as divinely ordained.
Which makes a lot of sense when you consider the influence of the Australian Christian lobby.
Oh, absolutely. The ACL is a major player in Australian politics, and they've been very effective at mobilizing conservative Christian voters.
They're known for their stance on issues like same-sex marriage and abortion.
Yeah, and those issues align perfectly with the values of Advance and ARC. They see those issues as central to the culture war.
And they're fiercely opposed to any attempts to change those policies.
Exactly.
So we're seeing this really interesting convergence of religious and political activism.
Yeah.
Groups like Advance ARC and the ACL, they're all working together, leveraging shared values to push their agenda.
And that convergence is incredibly powerful because it taps into people's deepest beliefs and values. It's not just about policy anymore. It's about identity, morality, and for some, their understanding of their place in the cosmos.
Wow, okay, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the political landscape. So knowing all of this, what's the takeaway for our listeners as we head into the 2025 election?
I think the key takeaway here is be aware, be informed, and be engaged. Don't underestimate the influence of this network or the power of the ideas they're promoting.
It's been eye-opening to see how interconnected these groups are, how they're using these sophisticated tactics and leveraging religious values to shape the political discourse.
It's so important for voters to understand these dynamics, to see the connections, the funding, the underlying motivations. That's the first step towards making informed decisions.
And don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that are being presented to you. Do your own research, fact-check information, think critically about the messages you're being bombarded with.
Exactly. And in democracy, it's our responsibility to be informed and engaged citizens. We have the power to shape the future, but we need to exercise that power wisely and with careful consideration.
Well said. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, a fascinating journey into the world of Australian right-wing politics.
It's been great exploring this with you, and hopefully our listeners are feeling more equipped to navigate the political landscape ahead.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another insightful exploration into a topic that matters. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.